The fire crept through the hills like a relentless beast, swallowing everything in its path. The sky was thick with smoke, casting an eerie orange glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood that had once been filled with laughter and life. Paramedic Chris Daniels and his partner Hannah Reyes pulled up to the last house at the end of Maple Street, their sirens wailing into the suffocating dusk. The radio crackled in Chris's ear. EMS Unit 12, report status. Evacuation mandatory. Fire perimeter approaching your location. Chris pressed the mic to his lips. Copy that. Dispatch. Last residents on the block, we're on it. He and Hannah approached the house, knocking urgently on the front door. After a few tense moments, it opened slowly to reveal an elderly couple, George and Margaret Walker. George stood tall, holding onto the doorframe with frail hands, while Margaret clutched a weathered photo album to her chest, her eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. We have to go, Hannah said gently, stepping forward. It's not safe anymore. Margaret shook her head, hugging the album tighter. This house, it's our whole life, she whispered. We've been here for 50 years. We can't just leave it. Chris exchanged a glance with Hannah. They'd seen it before, the unwillingness to let go, the attachment to memories woven into walls and furniture. I get it, Chris said softly, but we can't replace you. He looked at George, who stood silent, his jaw set in quiet defiance. You're what matters now, not the house. George's lip quivered, his gaze drifting over the charred horizon outside. Everything we own, our life, it'll all be gone. Chris swallowed, feeling the familiar weight of guilt creeping in. I know it's hard, but we can't wait any longer. Please, come with us now. Margaret hesitated, tears spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. Finally, George sighed heavily and gave a small nod. All right, he said, his voice breaking. Let's go. Margaret clutched his arm as they shuffled toward the ambulance, pausing for one final look at the home that had held their memories, their love, their life. Chris could see it in their eyes, the heartbreak, the feeling of abandonment. It twisted in his gut, but he had no choice. They left. Hours later, at the shelter, Chris checked in on the couple. They sat side by side on a cot, Margaret still clutching her album, George staring blankly at the wall. The weight of loss hung heavily around them, suffocating in its own way. You're safe now, Chris reassured them, though the words felt empty. George only nodded slowly, his breathing shallow and labored. By morning, both Margaret and George had been transferred to the hospital for complications due to smoke inhalation. A day later, Chris got the call that they had passed. He sat in the ambulance, head in his hands, guilt gnawing at his soul. We should have gotten them out sooner, Hannah whispered beside him. Chris didn't answer. They'd saved their lives from the fire, but not from the heartbreak. Weeks passed, and the wildfire was finally extinguished, leaving behind a wasteland of blackened earth and skeletal remains of homes. Chris and Hannah returned to the neighborhood one last time, their ambulance rolling slowly down the familiar streets now lined with charred debris and empty lots. When they reached the Walker's house, or what was left of it, Chris stopped the engine and stepped out. The structure had been reduced to ashes, yet something about it felt wrong. Hannah frowned, staring at the remnants. Doesn't it feel different? Chris nodded. Despite the destruction, something still lingered, something unsettling. Then they saw it. On the front porch, where no porch remained, sat two chairs, perfectly placed facing the road. Hannah took a sharp breath. Those weren't here before. Chris's throat tightened. They moved cautiously toward the house, stepping over charred wood and melted glass. On the ground, right where the front door used to be, lay Margaret's photo album. Chris knelt, carefully picking it up. The edges were burned, but the center remained intact, open to a picture of George and Margaret on their wedding day, smiling and full of life. His pulse quickened. I don't understand. Hannah turned slowly, staring at the empty street behind them. Someone's been here, she whispered. Chris flipped the album closed, his hands trembling slightly. Or they never left. Over the next few weeks, reports trickled in from firefighters and neighbors who returned to salvage what they could. They claimed to see figures in the ruins of the Walker home, an elderly man sitting on the porch, a woman gazing out a non-existent window. Some swore they heard voices murmuring late at night. Chris tried to brush it off, to tell himself it was grief and exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But then, one night, it happened. At the station, long after the others had gone to sleep, he sat alone in the ambulance, flipping through the patient logs. A soft knock echoed through the garage. Chris froze. Slowly, he stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold night air. There, sitting at the edge of the parking lot, were two chairs, and in them, silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. Chris blinked, his chest tightening. George, Margaret. The figures sat still, unmoving. Then, in the faint breeze, he heard it. Margaret's voice, soft and filled with longing. "We just wanted to go home." The wind howled through the lot, and when he looked again, the chairs were empty. Chris never spoke about it to anyone, but from that night on, whenever they drove past the burned-out ruins of the Walker home, he would glance at the empty porch, and sometimes, just sometimes, he swore he saw them. Two figures sitting side by side, waiting. Some losses are too great to leave behind. Some homes, never truly empty.